unemployment duration did not decrease, is that female unemployment duration started to match male unemployment duration, and people in labor force who become unemployed. This is the main conclusion of Abraham and Shimer's paper. The people who become unemployed, they still stick and looking for jobs rather than get out of labor force after 95. In the top right panel, you can see short-term unemployment rate, and again, unemployment duration is tracking short-term unemployment rate. Short-term unemployment rate is between 0 and 4 weeks if you're unemployed. Bottom left panel shows the long-term unemployment rate, and again, the solid line, which is unemployment duration, is tracking unemployment rate. Long-run unemployment rate is when individual is unemployed between 15 and 26 weeks, and very long-term unemployment rate, which is the bottom right panel, it's when individual is unemployed more than 26 weeks, and again, we see that the solid line is following the unemployment rate, but they kind of diverge a little bit in every graph after 95. Okay, so this is basically the summary of what I was talking about. Another thing that we need to remember when we look at the unemployment duration is that the exit rate from unemployment, so when an individual becomes unemployed and then exits from unemployment, it's a decreasing function of duration. So the longer you stay unemployed, the lower the exit rate from unemployment. And there's a seminal paper by Blanchard and Diamond that showed that this effect is stronger on the high unemployment rate. And basically in their paper, they assume that all individuals who are unemployed are the same, but the businesses only look at the duration of unemployment, and they rank people who are unemployed based on the duration of unemployment. And they show that if you are employed and then you become unemployed, your prospect of reemployment is better than for the person who was previously unemployed. So the longer you stay unemployed, the less likely you will be hired in their model. So that's the relationship between the time unemployed and the unemployment duration. Another area of research when we look at unemployment duration is the relation to the education. So what about the effects of education on unemployment duration? The effect is not straightforward. So for low levels of education, there's a positive relationship between education and the prospect of getting reemployed, but this effect goes away for high levels of education, and it becomes negative. So for example, Catalan using Finnish data showed that the effect, the positive effect of education on reemployment is up to 13 or 14 years of education, and then it turns negative. So the effect of education on unemployment duration is not straightforward. Another area of research when we look at the unemployment duration literature is the unemployment benefits. So the effect of unemployment benefits is positive on unemployment duration, but it's a small effect. So for example, typical estimates for the United States imply that 10% increase in the amount of benefits would increase average duration by about 7 to 10 days. And the more telling evidence is the time when the benefits they become exhausted. When you exhaust the benefits, then you can see the spike of exiting rates from unemployment. And in general, there are some papers that show that the benefit duration is actually more important when you look at unemployment duration rather than the levels of the benefits. So if you the longer you receive unemployment benefits, the greater impact it has on unemployment duration rather than the level of the benefits. Another paper shows that there's a positive effect between unemployment benefits on unemployment duration, irrespective of the business cycle conditions and the spell duration. The problem with when you look at the literature on unemployment benefits and unemployment duration, the problem is that there is no independent variation in benefit payments because variation in benefit entitlements for unemployed people is correlated with their previous income, and that is likely to be correlated with unobserved characteristics that affect unemployment duration. Uh, Another strain of literature on this topic is the unemployment duration and personality traits. So there are the big five personality traits: extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness to experience. And for example, in this paper in 2011, Usal and Polymer showed that if you increase the people who have higher conscientiousness, their probability of finding a job increases. But people who have higher neuroticism, that negatively affects on the probability, has negative effect on the probability of finding a job. So those personality traits, those unobserved characteristics, it has been shown that they also play a role when you want to explain unemployment duration. And for example, Zetterberg in 2005 pointed out that returns to personality traits vary over the earning distribution. And when we look at the personality traits, the effect of personality traits on unemployment duration will vary across occupations and sectors. Okay, so another area of research on unemployment duration is about racial differences in unemployment durations. And for example, Dawkins in 2005 and others show that residential segregation affects racial differences in unemployment duration, and it becomes worse. So the residential segregation worsens the racial differences in job accessibility and neighborhood peer effects. That's why in econometric analysis, I include one of the characteristics, controlling variables that I'm including is the race. Okay, so another area of research that looked at unemployment duration, they were looking at the physical distance, the proximity, the access to work, and competition among searchers. So they showed that improvements in access raise the probability that people living in urban fringes and rural areas will become employed. So it's more important for people who live in rural areas and urban fringes rather than urban centers. For workers living in large urban centers, the relationship between location and unemployment duration is insignificant. So this is the literature review. So we saw that there is a effect of time on unemployment duration, effect of education on unemployment duration, labor force attachment, race, unemployment benefits, tightness of the labor market, personality traits. And the question is, what is the effect of occupational licensing on unemployment duration? So I found an interesting, occupations and occupational regulation has been attracting researchers, and I actually found that the earliest quote when economists were interested in studying occupations that I could find is from 1613 from economist Antonio Serra, who wrote a short treatise on the wealth and poverty of nations, in which he was comparing, in which he says that if you want to compare two cities, and if you want to see which city is wealthier, you need to look at the number of different professions, and the larger number of professions, the wealthier the city. So even in 1613, people were looking at occupations and they were interested in that. Just highlights what kind of problems we're looking at. And actually, here I recently come across at the possibly oldest visual representation of a licensing body in the world. So here's a painting by Rembrandt in 1662 that shows one of the first licensing bodies in the world. This is Syndics of the Drapers Guild, from 1662, and it's currently owned by a museum in Amsterdam. So drapers, they formed a guild, and they were checking the quality of the fabric that they were selling. So, and this coming from 1662, such an old labor market institution. So in this paper, we want to look at the effects of that labor market institution on unemployment duration. So what do we know about occupational licensing? We know that occupational licensing increases wages overall by 15%, and for certain occupations, for example, for radiology technologists by 7%, and for massage therapists by 16%. So there's no definite positive effect on quality. So we know that, for example, there's a mild positive effect for building contractors, no effect on quality of dental health practitioners, and no effect on quality of florists. So licensing bodies, they always use this argument that we need to license an occupation in order to improve quality, but actually there's no clear confirmation that actually that's happening. At the same time, there are positive effects of licensing. For example, licensing can be used as a signaling device. For example, for minorities, they can use licenses to signal non-felony status. So this is just a small fraction of what has been done in terms of studying the effects of occupational licensing, and we want to know how does occupational licensing affect unemployment duration. So here I'm proposing the model that we can use to look at the effects. So assume there are J occupations. Assume there are J occupations, and each occupation has a pool of unemployed people for each occupation J, and the number of vacancies Vj. So the tightness of the labor market J is defined as theta J, which is the number of vacancies over the number of unemployed people. So if theta goes up, the labor market becomes tighter, and it's easier to find a job. Job finding rate is the function of the tightness of the labor market, is the function of theta, where M is the matching function. And in this model, I assume that M has the traditional form, which is the Cobb-Douglas form, which is kappa times theta. Theta is the tightness of the labor market, raised to the power of gamma. And kappa and gamma are parameters. Kappa is positive and gamma is between 0 and 1. This is the traditional functional form for a matching function. All right. And then the unemployment duration for occupation can be represented by the following function. So unemployment duration is inversely related to the job finding rate. So if the job finding rate increases, then the unemployment duration decreases. So if we plug in this matching function into that formula, we will get the formula for the unemployment duration. And then we want to know how the occupational licensing affects unemployment duration. For that, I will assume a particular functional form for a number of unemployed people and see how the licensing of one occupation affects this pool of unemployed people for other occupations. For that, oh yeah, so here we need to take, if we take the log of the unemployment duration, we will get this functional form that basically says that if the element of finding job rate goes up, then the unemployment duration decreases. If the number of unemployed people increases, then the unemployment duration also increases. And if the number of vacancy increases, then the unemployment duration decreases. Okay, so here I want to assume a functional form for the pool of unemployed people. So assume there is a continuum of unemployed workers of mass 1, and each individual I is considering occupations to apply for a job. Each individual I has an occupation-specific human capital Hij, and there's a threshold level Hj star. There's a threshold level of human capital for an applicant to be considered as eligible for a job. If applicant's human capital exceeds this threshold level for a particular occupation, then this applicant can be considered as eligible for a job. Okay, and then each individual I has an occupation-specific reservation wage, and this is the form that I'm assuming for the reservation wage. So the reservation wage depends on the human capital of individual for a particular occupation, and on this parameter omega, which shows the strengths of outside options. So what does that mean? That means that for a particular occupation J, if an individual has a lot of outside options for which he's qualified, and the market wage for those occupations is higher than for occupation J, then his reservation wage for occupation J should be higher. That's basically what this term here tells us. And beta is just a parameter, and it's negative to show that this difference between human capital of individual I, if it exceeds the threshold, it shouldn't be adding too much to the reservation wage for occupation J, and it's zero otherwise. So here for reservation wage, I also assume this element Vij, which is the preference for an occupation J. Okay, so what happens if for occupation K we will increase the threshold level of eligibility? If the threshold level for occupation K increases, an individual I human capital no longer allows him or her to be eligible for the job, then the reservation wage for the occupation J should decrease. Okay, and because the omega, the strength of outside option, decreases. So the individual is not eligible for some jobs, then that will negatively affect the reservation wage for occupation J. Then I'm going to assume G function, which is the distribution of occupation-specific human capital, and F function, which is the distribution of reservation wages for occupation J. And then we can define, finally, the share of unemployed individuals who will apply for a job in occupation J. So what will that be? That will be this element, which shows the share of people whose human capital is above the threshold for occupation J. So they're eligible according to their human capital, and at the same time, their reservation wage is below the market wage or equilibrium wage for occupation J. So in that case, they're qualified and they're willing to accept the wage, and that will define the pool of unemployed people for occupation J. Likewise, the share of unemployed individuals who will apply for occupation K is defined likewise. Okay, so if we're plugging this formula, or this functional form for the pool of unemployed people into our previously derived formula for the duration, we'll get the following result. And again, if we take the log of the duration, we will get this nice form that just shows that if the share of individuals who are qualified for the job goes up in the unemployment pool, then the duration increases, and also it increases if the share of people whose reservation wage is below the equilibrium wage. If that share goes up, then the duration increases, and if the number of vacancies increases, then the unemployment duration decreases. Okay, so what happens if we license an occupation K? Assume that occupation K becomes licensed, so we're shifting the threshold requirement for occupation K, so it becomes higher, usually it becomes higher. So what will happen? It will decrease the pool of unemployed people for occupation K, because we're increasing the requirements for that occupation. That will decrease the number of unemployed people for occupation K. But at the same time, because it affects the reservation wages for occupation J, this will increase the pool for unlicensed occupation J. So if we increase the threshold for occupation K, the reservation wages for occupation J will decrease. That will increase the share of people whose reservation wage for occupation J is below the equilibrium wage, and that will increase the pool of unemployed people for occupation J. So if we license occupation K, then the duration for occupation J should increase theoretically, because we will see the larger pool of unemployed people who will be willing to apply for job J. At the same time, if we license occupation K, then we should see the decrease in the duration, in the unemployment duration for occupation K, because we will see the decrease in the pool of unemployed people for occupation K, because we increase the threshold, the human capital threshold eligibility requirements.
Hey, Ilya.
Yes.
Sorry, question. Oh, maybe I missed. I came in slightly late. Is there an etiquette for asking questions, or do I just jump in?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Can you say again, why does the reservation wage go down for J?
Yes, good point. So let me go back a little bit. So here I assumed that this is the reservation wage for occupation J, and individuals who are so they have an option of occupations to apply for, and if they're qualified for occupation K, and occupation K has the wage that's above the wage for occupation J, then the reservation wage for occupation J should be higher. But now we increase the requirements for occupation K, which means that some share of people will no longer be eligible for occupation K, and that will like create the downward pressure on their reservation wage for occupation J.
Okay, it seems like you said that was going to then make it so that more of the J people would be employed because their wage went down also, but shouldn't there also be just a bigger pool of people who want to go to J there? And so it's not obvious to me that their match rate will actually increase because now there's more people trying to go to J.
Yeah, so here I'm looking at a pool of unemployed people. They're not employed, they're just a pool of unemployed people who are eligible for the job and applying for a job. So because for people who will be applying for occupation J, the reservation wage is, there's a downward pressure on their reservation wage, so that will increase the pool of unemployed people who will be applying for a job. So they will not be employed, there will be just more people who will be applying for a job. That's the assumption.
Yes.
Okay. But yeah, I need to think maybe more carefully.
No, that sounds great. That answers the question.
We also had another question that came up in the chat. Does licensing occupation J increase duration for all other occupations K, or just occupations that are unlicensed?
Yeah, so in this example, I'm looking at just 2 occupations, and I assume that like all occupations are unlicensed and one occupation becomes licensed, then that will affect all unlicensed occupations. That should affect all unlicensed occupations, but then I need to maybe model it more carefully, because here I assume, like I make assumptions that this effect will come through the effect of those people who used to be eligible for occupation K, but no longer eligible because the requirement is raised, and also the wage should be higher than for occupation J. So for those occupations that have lower wage than for occupation K, we should see that effect. Yeah. Good point. Okay. So we assume a functional form for the pool of unemployed people for occupation J, and we're trying to show how the unemployment duration will change if we license occupation K. And unemployment duration for occupation J will increase, and unemployment duration for occupation K will decrease. Okay, so this is basically the result of the model. This is the result of the model. So now I would like to bring the model to the data and test it. And again, it's a preliminary analysis. So right now I have the data, it's a cross-sectional data from CPS for 2018. And I probably should add also for 2019, but for now it's only cross-sectional for 2018. The licensing variable is defined in CPS as an indicator variable, actually it's defined in my analysis as an indicator variable if individual holds a license or certificate, and that certificate or license is issued by the state. So it's like a traditional way to define a licensing variable using CPS dataset, using Gemini group definition. So what is the descriptive statistic of the sample? So this sample, the number of observations 7,500, it's the unlicensed occupations, and 886 it's licensed occupations in the dataset. So if the individuals who are licensed in the dataset, they're on average they're older, and on average they have higher share of female unemployed workers, and this is only people who are unemployed, and looking for a job. So for unlicensed occupations, we can see the mean. These are indicator variables for education. We can see the means, and for licensed occupations, this means are higher for higher levels of education. So we can conclude that licensed occupations, they have higher education and they're older than unlicensed occupations. Then I plotted unemployment duration for unlicensed occupations. This is across the United States, and the lighter the region, the longer the unemployment spell for unlicensed occupations. And if we plot the same thing, unemployment spell, but for licensed occupations, we will see that the graph becomes darker. So on average, like you see that unemployment spell is shorter for licensed occupations. But actually plotting this graph allowed me to see that for some states, the unemployment duration for licensed occupations is actually longer than unemployment duration for unlicensed occupations. Just a few states, just 13, so for example, for North Dakota, Idaho, Oklahoma, the unemployment duration for licensed occupations is longer than unemployment duration for unlicensed occupations. And again, we need to take these statistics with a grain of salt, because in CPS, they do not track completed durations, and they are censored. So that means that these are not completed durations. So probably it's not telling us that, yes, the unemployment duration for licensed occupations is actually longer. We need to take into account that these are not completed spells. But for some regions, you can see that unemployment duration for licensed occupations is actually longer than for unlicensed occupations. Then I ran the log level regression on the duration using the indicator variable for licensing, and controlling for individual characteristics like age, race, veteran status, gender, marital status, and education. Here, as a robustness check, I also ran duration models using a very strong assumption that all the spells that we have, they're completed spells, which is not the case in the data, but yeah, I need to think more carefully. But as a robustness check, we can run duration models using that assumption, and we can plot survival function. So survival function, on the left you can see the survival function for unlicensed occupations, and on the right you can see the survival function for licensed occupations. So the survival function shows the probability that a person will, or the mechanism will fail, will survive after the period T. So what does that mean? That means that if the survival function is lower, then the probability of surviving is actually lower. And when we talk about unemployment duration, we want that to be lower, because if you survive, it means that you still unemployed. So you'd rather not survive and become employed. So we want that function to be lower. And for licensed occupation, if we assume that we have completed spells, that survival function is lower than for non-licensed occupations. Okay, so as a robustness check, I ran duration models with different distributions, with exponential distributions, distribution with Weibull distribution, and with log logistic distribution. So this is just formulas for the expected conditional expectation of unemployment duration, and I get similar results to the log level regression. So here, if we assume that xj is the licensing variable, then the elasticities in those duration models will be beta over alpha and beta j. So we need to look at the first two models. We need to flip the sign of beta to actually see the direction of the effect of the licensing on unemployment duration. So this will be important when we look at the results in the table. So here's a more descriptive statistic. So if we look at the duration, the mean duration for non-licensed occupation and licensed occupation, on average, for non-licensed occupation, duration is greater by 3 weeks. These numbers are in weeks. And then if we sort the average by state and occupation, the duration actually becomes longer. The difference becomes longer, about 8 weeks. So, and then if we take the log, again, of course, the difference is preserved. So there is a difference in average between non-licensed and licensed occupations in terms of the duration. And then if we run the model, the first one is log level. We can see that the licensing variable is statistically significant and it has a negative effect, which means that if you have a license, then the unemployment duration is shorter. Model 2 and 3, we need to flip the signs. That's just how those models are constructed. And again, that means that the licensing decreases on average unemployment duration in this cross-sectional data. And then we can actually calculate in model 2, 3, and 4 the marginal effect using delta method. If we calculate the marginal effect of licensing, that will vary according to the model. Depending on the model, it will vary from around 2 weeks to 3.8 weeks. So if you're licensed, then the unemployment duration on average is shorter by 2 weeks or 4 weeks, or actually by 13 to 26 days. This is 13 days, and this is 26 days. Okay, so just a conclusion. This preliminary analysis shows that licensing has an effect on unemployment duration. And if you're licensed, then your unemployment duration is shorter, 13 to 26 days. And the effect for specific occupations is yet to be uncovered. So in the econometric analysis, I looked at individuals who are licensed and non-licensed, but in the model, I'm looking at the occupations who become licensed and unlicensed. So the next step will be to look at the duration for a specific occupation, how that is affected for licensed and unlicensed occupations. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Ilya, can I ask something?
Mm-hmm.
So in the residual of your regression should be, to be consistent with the model, should be the vacancies.
Yes.
And presumably, there is some correlation between reservation wage and vacancies. So you may counter some, I guess, endogeneity issue. I guess one solution you may want to try could be to use the UI benefit as an instrument, because I guess UI will affect reservation wage, but will not affect job creation incentive, in addition, apart from the reservation wage channel. So I guess that might be something.
That's a great comment. Yeah, so in the data set that I currently have, maybe I should look for a better data set. For some reason, the unemployment benefits, I don't have unemployment benefits if I have unemployment duration. For those individuals, I don't see unemployment benefits. I need to look at why in CPS they don't report the unemployment benefits for those people